Welcome back to the RTS podcast. I am Mike Tushir, and I've got an interesting episode to bring to you guys today. So, back last June of 2019, Jacob Sipkin and I had a conversation with John Kiely. John became well known to us through the publication of his papers critiquing periodization, and a lot of what he wrote really resonated. So we had him on the podcast, like I said, June of 2019. And if this is your first kind of contact with John, I definitely recommend that you go back and give that episode a listen. It can help provide some context into how John thinks about training and how I think about planning training. And that can serve important background into this conversation. Now, just not to harp on the dramatic too much, but just to kind of lay out the background of things. After that podcast, by some measure of time, Dr. Mike Isreatel, which a lot of you will be familiar with, posted a critique of John's papers. And through conversation with Mike, I thought, I understand what his points are. I know how I perceive John's work, and it seemed to me that a conversation between the two of them would be really interesting. So it's been several months to get everything set up so that all of us can kind of join together on the same call at the same time and get this thing talked about. So that's what we've got today. So we're talking to John Kiely and Mike Isreatel. And I kind of, just to kind of give you the quick version of what you're getting into here, I wanted to have both of them kind of explain how we got to where we're at conversationally. So I start off having John kind of explain what he thinks, kind of a summary of his position. And then Mike goes into a critique of that position. But then really after that, I wanted it to be more conversational, and I wanted it to be more of a dialogue between the two, because they both have important things to say. And I hope that you'll agree that that's what you get out of this. We all intended to not set this up in debate style, and I don't think it ended up being that way at all. It's more just like everything in this podcast tries to be. It's more about fostering a learning environment so that we can make better training decisions. So with that preamble out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get into the conversation now. I hope you enjoy it. We were a bit time constrained, so there's that, and there's so much more to say and to discuss on a topic like this. So if you've got anything that you'd like to follow up on, be sure to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to me directly or reach out to either of these gentlemen as well. As for me, you can find me most actively on my Instagram at Mike Tushir or Reactive Training Systems. And of course, we've got the Reactive Training Systems YouTube channel that is active as well. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get into this conversation.
Yeah, okay, so I guess Mike, okay, hey Mike, how you doing?
Yeah.
You could just call me Isreatel or something.
Okay, well, I'm happy to go Mike Guy and Mike T, if that's okay with you guys.
Totally.
Yeah, suits me. All right, so Mike, you said you've got about an hour to do this, and I suppose about the same for you, John?
I'm good.
Okay. All right, so we'll just kind of jump right into things. And I'm gonna probably ask you guys to frame this stuff up as much as I can, because you'll have a lot better perspective on it and things that you want to say. But I suppose where I came into contact with all of this in the beginning, John, with your work, the papers that you published, a lot of the things that you had to say in there resonated with me, and I know that we've talked on my podcast before about that, and but just kind of as a way to sum it up, how do you think of the papers that you published? Like, what was the overall theme and kind of drive behind them? Maybe that'd be a good way to kind of start things off.
Yeah, well, the drive behind them was honestly to figure things out for myself. I had certainly the 2012 one, I had no expectation. That was the periodization paradigms one. I had no expectation anyone would read it. But it was just trying to figure it out for myself, and it took quite a long time. I'd say the first draft of that was maybe 2002, 2003. Got published in 2012. Yeah, so that was it. And I mean, I work in university now, but at the time I was working full time in practice, you know. So I guess one of the beefs I had, not one of the beefs I had, but one of the points of confusion I had was what I was seeing as a practitioner working with top class coaches was not what I was reading in the literature at all. And I approached it at first from the perspective that, you know what, there's something wrong with me here. I'm not seeing something. And for a number of years, I pretty much stalked a number of periodization theorists, just basically asking them questions. Help me here. I'm not seeing it. So yeah, writing in my spare time or trying to write. Eventually in 2012, I sent that paper in. I'd read somewhere that the average academic paper is read by 7 people. So I thought, well, if I hit 7, it would be okay. But at least I figured this stuff out for myself. And that was the motivation. That was it. Nothing more.
So some of the observations that you made, well, is there a way that you like to summarize, I guess, that paper in particular? Like, what's the overall theme, would you say? I suppose mostly for people who maybe haven't read it.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And if I was to summarize it really briefly, it is, I think there has been an illusion of validity created. And there's been a number of contributing influences on that. Cultural, we interpreted old science and then kept those interpretations and didn't review them and renew them. And we learnt more stuff, but, you know, we kind of ignored it. So I think if there's a key lesson for academics, it's, if you want to write about periodization, you really need to dig in and find out what the word means, define the word. Otherwise, you're just, for me, engaging in pseudoscience. For practitioners, hey, you know, whatever you feel works, but don't feel you need to adhere to this superstition, to this convention. By all means, do if it serves your purpose, but don't feel you need to. And I guess that second point is coming from my own struggle with trying to be the best practitioner I could be, and feeling like I don't feel that this makes sense, but I feel like I should adhere to it. And I come across, even top class coaches, I come across that all the time, that they feel that there's this background gospel that they need to genuflect to. Whereas for me, if you dig into the science, you dig into the origins of periodization, it's like there isn't really any science there. You know, there's all this talk about periodization as a theory, principles of periodization science. There is no science there. Use it, call training planning periodization if you want. Just be aware of the pitfalls of using that terminology.
So what I hear you saying is that a lot of your, maybe as a central theme, at least how it pertains to practitioners, is that people follow a convention of training planning even when it's not serving their purpose, and that they would be better served to break with that convention. Is that close to being right?
Yes, it is. Maybe let me just try again. And I mean, first off, yes, you're close to exactly what I meant there.
Okay.
What I felt myself as a practitioner was that there was this kind of cultural pressure to what we call periodize or train your training, and there's all these little kind of cognitive shortcuts, these little heuristics we use. Well, it's 4 weeks because this particular old dead white Russian said something about bi-monthly cycles or something about something else, and there's all different rationales. So basically there's a lot of, I can cherry pick to justify whatever I want to do. That's one side of it. The other side of it is I should plan in this way because that's what Moses brought down from the mountain.
Okay. And so, Mike, I think now would be kind of a good time for me to bring you into the discussion here. So oddly enough,
Can I just say something else, Mike?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't mind at all, but we're kind of doing this in reverse order. So I come out, spend a lot of years writing and I guess struggling with the idea that went into that original paper. And it's out there to be criticized. So my guy has criticized it, absolutely no problem. But it should really be the person with the critique that goes first in this. As I said, I've no problem. Obviously, we're not in court or anything like that, but it is the back way that I'm supposed to be defending myself before I even know what I'm being critiqued for.
Sure. I suppose maybe. So what I'll do is kind of give a little bit better introduction to all this. But since we're kind of a little bit time limited, I wanted to jump in and make the best use of the time that I've got you guys together. What my aim is to do is just to kind of lay out the narrative of how things took place. Like, John, I know that you saw an issue with how the periodization research was laid out, and that you wrote your papers, and I suppose about 7 months ago, looking back at my messages, that was when Mike, you had written your post in critique. We had some conversations about it. I had said that I think there's probably some misunderstanding here, and kind of getting the both of you guys together to have a conversation I thought would be interesting. So my aim in setting it up this way is mostly to John, since your papers came along first chronologically, was just that. Would that be all right then with you to proceed along that line?
All right with me?
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever way you want to play it. I was just pointing out that
sure,
it's hard for me to zone in exactly on what you want to know without understanding the criticism or the critique or the case you're asking me to answer.
Of course. Well, and I suppose at that point, now that that was kind of the scene, the state of things, and then Mike, it's been kind of several months ago now, but you had made a post kind of criticizing some of those positions, and maybe can you kind of restate what some of your thoughts are, or if those thoughts are still the same, and just kind of what you think about all this.
I don't. I don't actually remember those exact thoughts. That was a long time ago.
Yeah,
But
that's
I do remember the gist of the sort of the discontinuity there between the two lines of thinking. I can absolutely expound on that if you'd like.
sure.
So I think that um, perhaps my critiques of John's work were not properly caveated, in the sense that I actually think he makes a variety of very good points about a type of way of approaching periodization that has seen some significant application in sports and sports science. It has seen some texts and articles published around it and for it and because of it. But I don't think that way is the best way to go about conceptualizing or applying periodization. And I think that if we take without, again, some caveating, um, John's work to the extreme, and I'm not sure he had this in mind, and I actually would rather bet he didn't. If we take that to the extreme, then we throw the baby out with the bathwater as far as periodization is concerned. And I think, if I may, um, so some of the problems brought up with periodization in the work, sort of a bit non-specific, in the case that it's sometimes confusing to me to know exactly what it is being criticized, but what exact thing. Because I think the concepts of periodization, especially the general concepts, are incredibly useful. I think they're evident both from literature, from physiological inference, and from work with athletes, if you survey that work. But I think that very specific ways of applying the periodization models, and in some ways misapplying them, is not a good idea. And I think a lot of the critiques that John had, I think were more, in my reading, were more in reference to those, I would say, applications. In my view, there are misapplications in many instances. So, for example, one tenet of periodization could say that, you go from hypertrophy work to strength work to power work to speed work. You do active rest and then you repeat. And each one of those should be structured into 4-week mesocycles and a deload week, every 4th week. And that's how grandma did it. That's how mom did it. That's how I'm going to do it. And you could go even further into specific repetition ranges. Dr. Stone, who was my mentor and with whom I take a lot of education from, but with whom I hold a significant amount of disagreement as well, it's actually specifies distinct rep ranges, 10s, 5s, 3s, and 2s for all of those respective phases. And there are people in the periodization world who will debate with you the merits of doing 10 versus 12 versus 8. And I'm not one of those people. So I think that sort of over specificity of exactly how the paradigm should look falls to 2 problems for sure. One, it doesn't transfer very well from specific instance to specific instance. And 2, it misses giving the advice of what these specific recommendations, that they're underpinned by general principles. And it's the general principles that interest me a lot, and I would like them not thrown away with the bathwater. So the principle that developing a high level of work capacity can unlock the potential for developing a high degree of strength. The potential that a high degree of strength development probably is very important underpinning for developing a high degree of power. And after a certain relatively small amount of training, velocity maximization tends to occur in the absence of strength enhancement. I think there's very good evidence for all of those and very good physiological rationale. So you can approach sport training with, okay, look, our athletes are slow, let's make them faster. And what's the most specific way to make them faster? Well, they sport specific training. That makes a ton of sense. But I think we know enough about how physiology works and results work is that after a certain amount of time, sometime, depending on different conditions, it's going to be a different amount of time, which is when people say, like, oh, your speed phase needs to be 3 weeks, right? That's nonsense, right? Your speed phase could be 6 months for some people and work exceptionally well, depending on the people, depending on circumstance. But I don't think it's wise to throw away, and perhaps this was not the intention, the idea that just training speed exclusively, let's say for power athletes, tends to peter out after some time, and that time is shorter generally than the ability to train strength. And that strength training ability is shorter generally than the ability to add cross-sectional area to muscle. So after we sort of realize all these things, we say, okay, and it really depends on context, but at some point with pretty much all athletes, we're going to run into a cap where they can't increase their power anymore based on speed work alone, and they're going to have to get stronger. And then for still other group of athletes more mature in their training, at some point we run into a problem of, okay, they're about as strong as they're going to get for their given level of muscle size. And if in their weight class or in their power to weight ratio equation, they are can be allotted more muscle mass, it's probably time to do that. And also there's a natural sequence of adaptations that occurs there. You can't enhance the velocity characteristics of muscle mass you don't yet have. You cannot strengthen muscle mass you don't yet have. Thus, if you are aiming to sort of attack all three of these problems, probably best attacked sequentially for two reasons. One, they're built on top of another. So first you gain the size, then you make that size stronger, and then you take that strength and you teach it to move very fast, thus generating a high power output. And secondly, we know about the limits of concurrent training, and they are extant limits, and they're very well documented. And those limits are that if you try to train both for hypertrophy and for strength at the same time, you miss some measure of both. It's not the most optimal way to go about it. In the intersection of hypertrophy training and speed training, for example, is actually very, very significant. So if you're trying to add size while getting faster, it might not work out so well for you. Now, I think some speed training is probably good to do as a baseline for athletes that require speed and power. You never move away from it completely, which is, again, I think a very good critique of the sort of standard model of periodization where you do hypertrophy, strength, power/speed, and then you recycle. I think there should and can always be a mix, but I think some of those should predominate in that sequential pattern. That earlier training should probably be a little bit more biased, situationally, of course, depending on needs, towards hypertrophy. Later training should be a little bit more biased towards strength. And all the time, all the while, having some power development/speed development in there, and having some strength and having some hypertrophy work. And then the latest training prior to competition or prior to career peak, because you can vision it in both ways, should probably have a preponderance or more training than not of power/speed, and hypertrophy and strength will be less emphasized. So I think when you're looking at it at a sequential perspective and an emphasis perspective, the first thing that does is it just sort of demystifies it. And these are just things that sort of make sense, and a better idea has yet to be put forward. And some ideas that have been put forward, for example, concurrent periodization, it gets faulty at some points, and is not convincing to, I think, most folks who are deep thinkers in the field. Certainly doesn't have the research to back it. And then so it lays out this sort of paradigm for us, but I think that needs to be a very flexible paradigm, a very general paradigm, one which we use as a thinking tool to say, okay, we've run into, we want to enhance athletic performance in this particular way. What's the best way to go about it? And it's less of a guide as to more of a shit not to do. Like if you're like, all right, we got these football players, but they're 70 pounds underweight, they're in high school, let's work exclusively on their speed characteristics because I want them going pro at some day. Like, yeah, but they're too small. Probably good to work on some size while not neglecting speed work altogether. Then eventually make them much stronger once they're bigger, and then eventually start to maximize characteristics. So I think that, you know, the very extreme reading of some of John's work, which I'm not even imbuing to him as this intentionality, but I've seen folks talk about it, which sort of got me going on it, saying like, you know, periodization's a myth. Like prioritization of training, the specificity principle is not a myth. And I do think it is a principle. I think the evidence and reasoning behind it is good enough to call it a principle. And of course it can be questioned, and of course it has limitations. But I think that if we go a bit to the extreme, we sort of throw away all these constructs. And I think one of the more extreme readings is sort of like, I don't think he got his ideas here. Great if you read this kind of research. I don't think he does. Greg Glassman, I think, was quoted as saying, you know, there is no sports science. It's a myth. There's no periodization. It's a myth. Athlete coaching is always and everywhere a clinical process between the athlete and coach. But to be completely honest, I have no clue what that means. So you're a coach, you're not a clinician. Nobody's sick. first of all. Second of all, I think he meant like, and some people start to use this weird terminology like a dialectic. Like, first of all, that's in the social sciences also very poorly defined. But, if they're trying to say it's a give and take where you have to analyze what situation you're in and act accordingly, there are people in periodization science that would debate that, and they're fucking wrong and stupid, and I hate them. But they deserve all the criticism. But I think many folks in periodization, or many of the ideas, especially the ones I espouse, is that absolutely there's always context, but general theory can lead you to approach that context in a way that makes a whole lot of sense. So I don't think we should maybe get rid of all the general theory, just keep the stuff that is applicable and seems to make more sense.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Mike. And I mean, the reason I'm here is to hear what you have to say and to learn from it, not to argue with you. And I certainly don't care whether people agree with the paper or not. The purpose was for me to learn, as it will be with my next paper, as it will be with my next paper. And the only thing I would say there is nearly everything you said there is not exclusive to periodization or non-periodized training, whatever that might look like. The only things that I picked up that you said that were relevant to periodization is there's a natural sequence and one thing is built on top of another. Now, again, I don't know your context. The context I work on, definitely a natural sequence. I don't think there's any evidence. There is no evidence. There could be no evidence for that. There is no natural sequence. There is always careful management of training. Without question, there is always that. There is always not too much stress, too much overload, too much fatigue, too much monotony, too much intensity, too much volume. There's always those difficult trade-offs. And getting back to your first question, Mike T, for me, periodization made very grand, really blunt assumptions about that. This is how you manage intensity. This is how you manage volume. And in real life, when you're working in elite sport, that's not the way it goes. You're always walking on a knife edge. You're always building in acceptable levels of safety. You're always trading off intensity and volume, monotony and variation, fatigue versus compensation adaptation. So I guess the 2 points I would push back on is a natural sequence, no evidence. I don't know what it means. If you're saying strength before power, maybe with very junior athletes, but once you're up to elite level or senior athletes, that doesn't exist. And one thing is built on top of another. Again, no evidence for that, as far as I'm aware, and I've been kind of nerding out in this field for quite a long time. So maybe just to go back to you, Mike, one of the things you said at the start was that at least my critique was very vague. But I'm kind of pushing back here. Periodization is extremely vague. If you're writing a theoretical paper that's supposed to apply to all sports, it has to be vague. But if you'd like to pin me down on like a specific application or a specific context, I mean, I'd be happy to get as specific as I can then.
Yeah. I don't seem to be able to pull up the actual article in front of me. When I read it a couple of times, I could actually pick out sentence by sentence things I did not have particular agreement with. I think that would get mildly tedious, I think, if we went down that route. But I can bring up at least one thought on why a sequence can be developed without recourse to any understanding of dogma that has to come in before it. So in many sports, timing is an essential thing. So that's sort of part one. You're not expected to be prepared maximally at all times. You're expected to be prepared for competition at a certain time. And in some sports, this, like, take an easy example, once every 3 months, a weightlifter is expected to perform very, very well. maybe at a sort of peak, right? And then, so fact one is we know that timing is important. And fact two is we know that all qualities compete with each other as far as development is concerned. And this requires no underpinning. Strength doesn't have to underpin power or anything like that. But we know that if you train a lot for strength, then you soak up a whole lot of your allotted fatigue per any unit time, and you can train less for power or less for sports-specific movements. So for a weightlifter, for example, this would be, if you're doing a lot of sets of 5 and sets of 3 in the squat and then the press and then so on and so forth and heavy pull, then there's a certain amount of training that you cannot have at the highest quality for the actual dynamic competitive lifts, for example. And weightlifting is an easy example because it's profoundly simple and you can sort of scale up from there. The only thing simpler is powerlifting, but it's barely a sport as far as most sports scientists would consider. One line. So, Mike, I'm totally kidding. Please don't kill me next time. So we know that the qualities are competitive with each other, and that's fact number 2. So if we are faced with a realization, okay, we have the meet is 2 months away, and we can hypothetically train for strength and power concurrently at the same time. And then both of them get, they rise in their abilities at roughly similar rates, but that's a trade-off there. And then we have another choice, which is to say, okay, well, really, what we really need before a weightlifting meet is to be amazing at these specific movements. And we know the specificity says we need to train them a lot, more than you would normally train them. And it's okay if we're not so good. It's okay if we're not our best at the supporting movements. So the snatch and the clean and jerk, for example, at near competitive loads, we probably want to train that more in the several weeks preceding the meet than on average. And in order to make fatigue room for that, and there's a multitude of other reasons, velocity increases and athleticism increases as fatigue goes down. So we just want a lower fatigue environment in general for peaking. So all of a sudden the allotment we're working for fatigue shrinks because we want it be more expressive. And also that allotment gets filled significantly with more of the weightlifting specific moves and their sort of velocity equivalent derivatives. Now, where does that leave room for the strength lifts, heavy squats, heavy pulls, heavy presses? It doesn't leave as much. So then you could say, okay, the 50-50 model of doing 50-50 sort of applied weightlifting moves and basic strength moves, it suffers a problem that if you take it all the way into the meet, the last several weeks before the meet, you could come in and do really well at the meet, and you could brag to your buddies at the meet, like, yeah, I also squatted a PR last week and, for sets of 5. And they're like, give you the nobody gives a shit medal because they don't give medals in weightlifting for how much you squatted for sets of 5. But you could be out totaled by 2.5 kilos because the guy you're competing against squatted less before the meet and did more clean and jerks, which is what they actually award medals for. So because you have an allotted amount of fatigue to work with, and that you have to be really good at this thing, and specificity says the more you train something, especially near when you're going to do it, the better you get at it, you kind of develop this natural structure of, okay, if we have 2 months, just as an example, I'm not dogmatic about the months whatsoever. Just if we have 2 months unit time, we could even do 2 weeks, 2 months unit time. The first month maybe should predominate more, relatively speaking, in the basic strength lifts, because we still have to get that up, right? That's a very, very important part of fueling our performance in the actual specific movements. But at some point, and even if we say it doesn't somehow underlie the specific movements, it's just something you also have to get good at, that's totally fine. But it has to get cut down. And the specific movements and the force velocity characteristics of the competition have to be cut up in the second month. So automatically you have this phasic shifting where you do a little bit more strength, a bit more specific power type stuff before the meet, and vice versa. So I think that's because sports need a specific timing, that periodization generally comes out of that. And you could add a third layer to that and say, what about month 1, just as an example? You could say, okay, we also have this problem with this athlete that they're a couple of kilos shy of maxing out their weight class, and they could use bigger legs because their squat is definitely the limiting factor of what's going on here. It's multiple lifts have confirmed the same thing. They physically have to small legs. So you could say, okay, when is it time to get big legs? We also know hypertrophy and strength compete with each other just on a fatigue window basis. So we can say, okay, we're going to take month 1 to build a bit more size, train strength and the lifts themselves a bit less. Month 2, lift goes up, lift training goes up, strength training goes up a lot, hypertrophy training takes a back seat, and then in month 3, lift training goes up significantly, and the other hypertrophy and strength stuff go down significantly so that we can have the best possible peak. So I think periodization in that way, that phasic structure develops from those 2 factors of you have a specific need and you have constraints because you can't do it all at the same time.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Again, what I got to say is what you're talking about there is coaching judgment. That's not what I think of as periodization at all. And if you're talking about coaching common sense, nobody, certainly me, is arguing against that. So, yeah, and that's nothing that I talked about necessarily in that 2012 paper. All I was like, the main take home for that 2012 paper is don't believe the dogma, use your common sense, use your coaching eye, use your experience. But I certainly wouldn't argue against any of the common sense points you made there. The only things you've said that I do argue against is, well, you said there was a natural sequence. You said one thing was built on top of another. You mentioned the problems with concurrent training. Concurrent training is the reality in most sports. And from an academic perspective, first of all, yeah, the first study, 1980, found a problem with concurrent training. Other studies since have found problems with concurrent training. Other studies, even with elite athletes, have found no problems. It's clearly a complex topic that is totally down to how you negotiate the trade-offs. If you do it well and precisely, it can work, and it has to work in a lot of sports. If I'm an Olympic rower, I need to keep my strength up as well as my, let's say VO2 max and manage body weight and all those things. So again, nobody in their right mind, I would think, with any experience would argue against what you've said there. I think that what we're slipping into here, we're using the word periodization, but we haven't really defined it, like what we mean by it. I think technically there is a very precise, like even academically, and I know we don't want to talk academically.
We can if you'd like. I know the academic definition off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of them around. I don't think there is one, but
sure.
originally it was where the word popped up was in Matthew's, 1980 English translation of Fundamentals. Pops up late in the book, and he has kind of 5 principles, what he calls principles, and then he calls it a theory. They're not principles because, again, there's a specific scientific prescription of what a principle is. They're basically his ideas.
Notions.
Yeah, exactly. And none of them are notions that we would hold. It's about, the waveform of training and the cyclical nature of training. Things like that are so vague that they don't really give you any clue what to do. But that's what he meant as periodization. Now, as we know in practice, it's become to mean the same as planning. I guess the issue I have is that in the real world, in the coaching world, we hear this term periodization theory with this resonance of science, and we hear these phrases like the science of periodization and the principles of periodization. There is no real science of periodization that you can pin down. There is no clear definition of periodization. Now you're going to come in with maybe Mike Stone's definition, and that's great. And I think it's a good working definition. But that's not the only way to plan. You can also plan. Obviously, you have to time frame. Obviously, there's a competition at the end. Obviously, you have to trade off and balance the volume, intensity, specific training versus general training, etc., etc. Obviously, you have to do all those. I guess my argument is, but why do we have to do it against this imagined backdrop of, well, this is a science, this is a theory, these are laws, all this dogma? Because in the practical world, and I'll finish up now, there is a real consequence of that. There is coaches thinking that, feeling nearly guilty that I have to kind of do what periodization says because that's the science. There is no science of periodization. There is a pseudoscience of periodization.
Can you give me an example of something a coach would feel guilty about applying from periodization that he would sort of be averse to applying if he was really being honest with himself?
Sure, absolutely. Natural sequence, to, if you don't mind me using that term. So strength before power, for example.
I've got a concrete example of that, if you don't mind my interjection.
Your interjection would be welcome.
So in the prep for the 2018 Worlds, I was coaching Brett Gibbs, and so traditional periodization structure for a powerlifting competition, we would start out further from the competition at lower intensities, higher volumes. The intensity would go up and the volume would go down as we approach the competition. However, working with Brett for a couple of years at that point, I had noticed that, let's focus in on his deadlift, because it was the effect was especially pronounced there. I noticed that whenever we trained at low intensities in the deadlift, relative for a powerlifter, so I'm talking about 70-75% of 1RM, his deadlift got better. His strength went up. When we trained at middle intensities, 80-85%, his response was still pretty good, not as good as low intensity. And then the higher the intensity, the more blunted the training effect seemed to be on his strength. So we essentially did the reverse. So going into the 2018 Worlds, we started off his second to last block before the World Championship. We did the middle intensity zone, so 80-85%, where he had still pretty good response. And then we actually went lower intensity as we got closer to the competition. His final block before competition was 70-75%. It worked out great. He went into the competition, smashed a personal best. He was the first, he was the heaviest powerlifter to total 10 times body weight, won the world championship. So happy ending. But I can tell you that in the lead up to that, I was extremely nervous, because this is one of these ideas, if that doesn't work, then I look like a fool, because I'm doing something that's the opposite of what you should do. Now, if it works, then great. And it happened to work at that point. We were following athlete response, and that's what I really advocate for. But I can tell you that the run up to that, I was nervous. It was one of those things like, man, I hope this works, because I'm going to look like an idiot if it doesn't.
It's a really interesting example. So if he got injured or he bombed out, you would have seen that as a failure and you wouldn't have tried it again. You'd have gone back to your normal periodization. But what we do with, I think one of the things that can happen, and this isn't an issue with periodization, it's an issue with the way we think. If I stick to convention and things go right, it's because of convention. If I stick to convention and things go wrong, I did it wrong. You have those kind of, and then if you take a risk and things go wrong, I'm never taking a risk again. Well, the likelihood of injury, the likelihood of success or failure, I would think are you don't change them by sticking to the same thing over and over again or doing something different every time.
Yeah, I can tell you that it's one of those scenarios where if I had done it the way that it should be done, the traditional volume and intensity structure, and it didn't work. Like, I think if you took an honest look at his past results, it wouldn't have worked, at least not as well. You would look at that and go, oh, well, I did everything I was supposed to do. I don't know what happened. And it would absolve me, the coach, of some responsibility because I did what I was supposed to do. But that's not, in my view, that's not the coach's job. The coach's job
Sure.
is to show some courage, and make the best call that you can, regardless of what the prevailing wisdom, I guess, is.
Well, I guess the truth of it is, we don't know what the best way is. but we need to tackle it in a careful, cautious. We need to give it a lot of consideration, or we should, to best service the athletes we work with. And I guess, and this is bringing it back around to the topic of periodization, I think we get lulled into thinking along rules of we should do. And don't get me wrong, there's a place for that, in the sense that if you were a young coach or you were a university coach with hundreds of athletes, you can't individualize. You're going to need some way to chunk things up. And, if you want to pick your favorite periodization model, why not? Or pick a bit of this one or a bit of that one. Sure, whatever helps. But I don't think it is better than sitting down and just planning from first principles. Here's where we are. Here's where we need to get to. What are the various routes that are open to me? I know that I can't be stupid. I need to balance intensity volume. I need to balance fatigue recovery, blah, 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 specific versus general. I need to balance all those things. And I can stick to this comforting set of rules, or I can figure it out myself.
Would you,
by all means, use the rules if it suits you, but you may get be more accurate, be more agile, have less kind of constraining ideas. If you see it for what I think it is, it's an open field. Use your common sense, use your coaching eye, use your experience. Forget this set of myths.
When you're talking about planning from first principles, to throw it back to Mike, would you add to that, in normal cases, the sequencing of, like Mike, you mentioned hypertrophy, strength, power, that, in a normal setting, that's a rational sequence of things? Would you say that can fall in line with that type of first principles planning? Or
yeah, I'd go further. I wouldn't say it falls in line. I would say it's derived by first principles. I think if you approach everything from first principles only and first, as far as program design, you end up rediscovering the same outlays, the same interactions of those first principles that generate very, very similar structures of programs. And then after you've observed enough structure of program similarity, you can start to sort of codify and name those similarities. And you can explain why they're very prominent and very likely. So for example, if we were to design a car on first principles, you say, okay, we need some way to locomote. It seems like wheels do a pretty good job of transferring vertical forces into horizontal forces, minimizing friction. Put a fucking wheel on there. And then we need something to generate power, horse, can't put a horse in a treadmill. That seems unlikely. And then we dive down first principles long enough. We design an internal combustion engine, steering wheel, etc. That's a good way to design the first car. It's probably a grotesquely inefficient way to design the car in 2020, because principles in engineering have been summarized into workable heuristics that apply most of the time. And no good engineer is ignorant of the fact of first principles. And engineering school is what you go to understand the principles that when you show up later as an employee at Boeing, you don't have to redesign the airplane. You go, this is how we build the 777 or the 787 Dreamliner. And now you're going to look through the manual of how we build it, and whatever component you're assigned to, you're going to be able to understand it based on principles. So I think, Mike and John, I think it is a disaster. Heavy terminology, but I'll back it up. When folks only know the heuristics of periodization, like hypertrophy, strength, power, and you're like, why? I used to ask my students that when I was a professor. Why is the sequence like that? And they're like, because that's what you're supposed to do. I'm like, you're an idiot. Get the fuck out of here. I wasn't legally allowed to speak to my students that way, they said, but I found them after class and hurt them physically. So, you have to be able to understand the first principles. But if you run the first principles enough times, they tend to generate a predictable structure, not a dogmatic structure, not a structure that never changes, a structure that changes with sport, with application, with the time scale, and absolutely in every instance has to be modified to fit the athlete. To the Brett Gibbs example, the first thing that comes up to me is that the deadlift for many people is an exceptionally fatiguing lift. So perhaps it wasn't as much an issue of the heaviness of the deadlift, that it was the heaviness multiplied by the expected sets and reps that he was supposed to get, maybe combined to form way too much fatigue and would essentially overreach him too quickly. But in similar sets and reps, perhaps there was a workability there that the fatigue wasn't exceeded and very, very good training practice resulted. What I would like to see is, and so maybe some deadlift loading combined with squat loading as far as total program loading, it may be sort of excursions into the 90% plus zone or whatever you call heavy, maybe are just saved for once every 2 weeks, or maybe even never. Some folks get great deadlift results by never going maximally, and that's okay. What I wouldn't do with that, and I'm not saying you guys are, is when designing a program for someone else, I wouldn't be like, well, let's sort of find out how their deadlift works. Well, a very good assumption is one of specificity, and this has been laboratory confirmed with a whole lot of research, is that people get really good at stuff they do, right? The specificity principle, I'm sort of academically interested in debating. In the real world, I don't debate it because I think it's quite obvious. And that most of the time doing what you're supposed to be doing at the competition or something very close to it is the way to get the best acute results. But it may have some downsides. It might not be sustainable for long-term training, so on and so forth. And so what you would say is, okay, normally, like when we're trying to deadlift a 1RM in a meet, normally the several weeks at least preceding that meet, we're gonna try to find a way that ecologically for that athlete, we get as close as possible to pretty heavy weights so that the more obvious problem doesn't occur. And this problem I've seen in my own training, the training of athletes I've coached in powerlifting and many other sports and tons of other powerlifters, of you fail to prepare with the kind of poundages that you're going to see on the platform. And then you're like, man, I hit a huge PR of 5s on deadlift. And then you go up to your 1 rep max in a meet and your grip goes. And you're like, I never had this problem in sets of 5. It's because you never pulled it. And I mean, Mike, you'd probably be familiar with this. The way your body shifts with maximal and near maximal loads is a little bit different than the way we shift with 5s and so on and so forth. So that specificity of practice with those heavy loads is very valuable. And as a first principle, we want to inject it later into a program. Now, there are downsides to that, absolutely, for individual athletes. I would use it as a careful rule set. In general, you want to lift heavier before your meet than in most other times of the year. Absolutely. But there are huge downsides, and there is such a thing as too heavy. And for some lifts, super heavy doesn't yield the kind of benefits you would. So I would apply the general template of strength periodization for powerlifting to everyone. And then as you develop a relationship, as you auto-regulate with them, as you monitor the athlete, you can say, okay, we used to go up this high, but now we're just going to go up this high before the meet, and it works super well. Or our deadlift volume was expected to be this, but it's that. The one thing I absolutely hate is, I'm the volume guy. I'm the guy that says do whatever number of sets fits the program, not like XYZ sets. I absolutely hate when people say like, 3x5, that's a strength program. Like, how do you know it's not 6x5 for some people? You could do 3x5 for people maybe just lose muscle. Or 1x5 is like a huge stimulus for some folks. So there's absolutely wiggle room there. I just wouldn't do like, I wouldn't say like, it's all ecological and it's all case dependent and it all has to be rediscovered. I wouldn't just be doing like sets of 10 the week before a powerlifting meet. I think we can pretty much rule that out in most cases. So I think periodization is very valuable in the sense that it gives you this general structure that emerges from first principles that you have to understand in order to apply as a good coach. You can't just cut off, like we have this root of the tree and then we have all the leaves. You can't cut off the leaves and put them on something else. You got to keep the root. But once you have that structure, you can take it and use it as a basis, not an exclusive prescription for program design. And if it checks all the boxes, if it makes sense, then you go into phase 2, which is auto-regulating and noting athlete responses. Periodization is sort of like a recipe. Yeah, here's the cookie recipe and you put it in the oven, but it doesn't always come out the same. So you got to pull it out every now and again, poke forks, whatever the fuck. I don't know anything about cooking. I don't know why people do the fork. I don't know what I'm looking for with a fork test, but hypothetically people will do something. The fork tells them some kind of information about whether or not the cookies are ready to come out, right? So I think that no amount of periodization replaces poking the cookies every now and again. And some recipes are weird and some people are different. And the poking is going to be much more preeminent of a feature of your interaction with athletes than the periodization itself. Like the plan could be very, very general and then a ton of auto-regulation. And for other folks, especially beginners, auto-regulation, like you just add the load and they keep getting stronger. How much auto-regulation do you need? Well, you always need to be paying attention to it, but the recipe is a really, really big deal. So that's sort of my view on it. And I do think John, to your point that at elite levels of athletes, you're essentially dealing with a very complex adaptive fine-tuned system with sort of like multiple allosteric regulations. And as you push one thing and the other thing goes, that it's really, really, really tiptoeing, real super tiptoeing. So I think the super general principles of periodization apply actually really well for an intermediate, because for beginners, everything works. You just train them, just do this, and you get stronger. For the intermediate, the general structure is very apparent. And then for the advanced, you're not going to be doing a lot of the sort of subsystems training anymore. Advanced people have plenty of hypertrophy, have plenty of general strength. For them, it's a give and take of various technical approaches and very specific problems. So you're going to be working in that rarefied air anyway, in which standard periodization, so to speak, doesn't seem to even be evident, because it's almost like, how much climbing gear do you need to go up Mount Everest? A shitload to go up the whole thing, but at the very top summit, you only need very, very specific gear, but the exact kind of specific gear you're doing and the exact, does the mask fit the person, not do you have one, is super, super important in that regard. How's that for banter and blathering? What did I just say?
No, I mean, again, I guess maybe I think we're kind of talking about slightly different things. To me, I'm hearing training common sense, which I certainly don't argue with. And again, and I don't have an issue. I don't care whether people call what they do periodization or not. And typically when I'm working practically, I'm parachuted in. I'm working with the head coach who.
You parachute into the training hall? That's awesome.
Yeah, that's what I do. Yeah, that's how I arrive. Parachute in and get torpedoed out. So, the head coach will have they might have some very, very strict periodization ideas. They might have very loose ones and be open to suggestion. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter. But what I see on the ground is periodization the misinterpretation of periodization has caused a lot of trouble. I've worked with coaches very successful, multiple Olympic medalists. I use a Matveyev model. The next day I'm with a different coach, similar levels of success. I use a Bondarchuk model. You look at what they're doing and you're doing the same thing. You're just giving it different labels.
I couldn't possibly agree more with that. I'm sorry to, please continue, but I have more to say to support your point.
Well, so that's one thing. And so let's agree that there's a lot of conceptual confusion. If we go back to the very strict definition of what periodization is, it's not what we talk about now. And that's a frustrating point for me because, again, I've no axe to grind. I don't care. When I go working, I toe the line. And if you say this is the periodization model we use, I say, okay. But then I'm going, okay, how can I work around the edges here to make this less risky, more beneficial? How can I, do what I do to make this better? But I still do think there's a problem with thinking there's a right way and a wrong way. A lot of if we look at the extent of inter-individual variation between any group of humans, we can't possibly go look at, well, it's this rep range for this and it's this rep range for this other outcome. That just doesn't work. That natural sequence totally depends on your genetic makeup. Your personal beliefs will have a big impact on it, and your prior training history. It's not going to be we're all going to fit into the strength, power, speed type model. To me, that's that's gone. But if you're planning for 150 people, you're going to have to make a choice. Well, and maybe it makes sense then to go, well, we'll do strength, we'll do slow, we're not going to push them to max, and then maybe we'll do power. All of that is fine. The issue I have is just people trying to dress it up with some cherry-picked science and say, well, because of this, or this old dead Russian said this, so therefore we should do this forevermore. Mm-hmm. That's the stuff that kind of,
sure.
I think, come on, we got to grow up as a culture.
So two things to say. I think that there are some things that are probably more correct than others. So I would love to absolutely move away from right and wrong thinking, but sort of remain in that middle ground of some stuff probably more true than other stuff if we're taking guesses. And all we do in sport training is take educated guesses anyway. So, if someone said, you don't really know what causes the best hypertrophy, is it sets of one or is it sets of 10? I wouldn't roll the dice on sets of one for most people unless I got really good evidence of the fact that from years of training them or something like that. So I think that periodization and just knowledge of sport training is what you would call common sense. I think you're very intelligent. What to you is common sense is to many coaches by no means clear. But
it took 10 years to write a paper. I'm not very
well. It was a very, very erudite paper. So most people take their whole lives to write 0 papers. It's by no means clear to me that most coaches can read or write. I'm totally kidding. Just kidding, coaches. Hey, all right, we're all friends. So. But on a serious note, I think that the generalities are a very good place to start. They are supported by physiological evidence and research and experimental evidence and research, although not often in the populations we'd like to apply them to. I think the general rep ranges, definitely not specific reps, are a good place to start. And then you sort of measure if you're actually getting what you're actually getting. I think there's that we know nothing is a bit of a stretch for me. I'm not saying you're saying that. Some folks have read the paper and interpreted it that way. I think we know some good stuff, but we know generalities that can sort of lead us on a really good path to beginning the training process, to begin training program design. We would call common sense. I call the entire understanding of periodization is just linking together things that are common sense and maybe not so common sense that you got to think about for a little bit, and then they make a ton of sense. And then you use them to design a training plan, and after that, you have a good plan. That being said, your sort of illustration of you get somewhere, and the guy's like, well, I'm a Matveev guy, and I'm a Bondarchuk guy. That to me not only makes no sense at all, but frustrates me to a huge, huge degree. Those folks, in my understanding, actually just don't know periodization. There's just some guy wrote a book and they think that guy knows what he's talking about, so they just do shit they read in the book, and they can never justify or explain why they're doing a lot of stuff except as a recourse to, well, Matveev said it. He was Russian and had steroids in the USSR. Remember all those sprinters? You just get this hazy idea that they sort of knew what they're doing. So I think that in my sort of charitable view of periodization, the way I understand it, for example, the way my colleagues at RP understand it, the way Chad Wesley Smith, for example, understands it. He's been one of my great collaborators because he comes from an athletic background, not from an academic background of sports science, and he's coached a gazillion people and has been a high-level coach himself. He's read Bondarchuk and all this other stuff. The way we understand periodization is a set of ideas that make sense, that can coalesce together to produce more reasonable training outcomes, more favorable ones than not. That's it. And a lot of times, I'll be invited to go talk to folks, or every now and again, collegiate strength and conditioning coaches will set up phone calls with me, which is not something I do very often anymore because I'm so fucking famous and busy. I'm just kidding. I'm at home crying to myself. So a lot of times folks, the collegiate strength and conditioning in the United States and various other governing bodies would call me to talk about, some ideas of mine they had read and sort of to maybe ask me some questions about guidance in their own philosophies. And they'll say stuff, John, like you just said, like, well, I'm a Matveev guy. And it's incredibly difficult for me to say very charitably, I'm not entirely sure what that means. And I don't think you're entirely sure what that means. So, for that, I always break that stuff down and say, let's just talk about principles, right? You want your guys fast, on the day of the game. And they're like, yeah, fast as possible. Like, sweet. It's probably a good idea to do some more speed work before than at other times of the year when you don't have as much care and you want to work on other stuff. And they're like, yeah, uh-huh. And they're like, okay, sweet. And they're like, what do you think of the way Matveev does it? And I'm like, I think that's one of many approaches that can work. But I wouldn't so much read into here do 3 reps or here do 2 sets. I would say, okay, are we working on the fitness characteristics that are most needed? And then in the other times when we're not working on them, are we working on fitness characteristics that it's reasonable to subsume underlie those other fitness characteristics? And or even if we don't subscribe to the underlying ideas, we can say that other stuff we also need to work on, but not in a timely fashion, right? Here, another interesting one is decay rates, right? So we know that once you have established hypertrophy, it actually doesn't really go down with just the volumes you're used to in strength training. So there's a sequence that emerges from that where you can say, okay, if we need someone bigger and stronger, probably good to get them bigger first and then stronger after, because then we could just be strong and not have to worry about doing hypertrophy training and do lots of strength training, so we can be strong at whatever time we want, and the size hangs in there. If hypertrophy was a rapidly decaying construct, then you would have to train hypertrophy in size sort of all the time, which is extreme concurrent proponents would say that. They'd be like, well, you didn't do any hypertrophy work this week. Well, I fucking have to, because strength keeps my size. And that's a debate that can be solved just by looking at the literature of the various effects and experience of coaches. And almost everyone will tell you, look, like, yeah, to build size, you usually need to raise volumes to levels that will, for many reasons, but mostly fatigue, impact strength performance and strength training. Once you have size, you don't just poof lose it. Size is pretty difficult to lose. Whereas, if you have if you have strength, for example, training for size, like getting away from sets of 3 and 5 and going to sets of 10, actually for high level athletes depresses their strength considerably, because neurological pathways seem to be much more quickly adaptive than the physiological anatomical stuff that we've set up. So if someone's like, okay, I've trained my pecs to be really, really strong for the bench. My bench is going great. I'm hitting PRs like in a 1 rep max, but I need more size. My pecs are just too small. I'm going to take like 4 weeks before the meet and do sets of 10 to 15, get my pecs sore, get them bigger. That would probably not work for most people, because you're reversing the easily and quickly reversible neural and technical qualities that lead to strength. And yeah, you are gaining muscle, but that muscle gain is only going to benefit you if you retrain your nervous system, primarily in some muscle architecture, to milk as much out of that as possible. So stuff like that, to me, is much more preferable conversations of what you would call common sense. I would call periodization, right? Versus name dropping and saying, what do you think about this model versus that model? What do you think about this guy versus that dead Russian guy versus this American guy? And it's actually easy to critique folks like that if you just do the common sense periodization and not have to get buried so far in what you, I think, rightfully call dogma of just like, well, this is what this is what, Isurin said is this, that thus it's this. Well, that's anti-scientific, because everyone's fallible. And Isurin's ideas are both, we could say, wildly out of date in the literal sense, published in the 70s and 80s. For the love of God, we've gone to learned some stuff. There's no magic to them, and they can be subject to the same examinations, whether or not they work, and not whether or not they work, but more like what parts of them are super good and we want to keep, and what parts of them just make no fucking sense, because everyone has little weird quirks. Like after I'm done publishing and talking about strength training, and after Mike is done and after you're done, we're gonna leave like a sort of like a litany of work, and some of it will just be weird kooky shit we do. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen videos of me squatting. I do this weird hip tilt. I don't even defend it. It's fucking weird shit I do, and people are like, why you do the hip tilt? I don't fucking know. It's just, I can tell you reasons that won't make any fucking sense to you. I'm not worried about those. I think it's okay if time takes them away. Nobody learns that lesson. But there's other stuff I do that maybe will survive the test of time because it has an underlying truth. So I think when we look back on periodization history, we should be picking out stuff that has underlying truth that still makes sense, and leaving it for folks to learn, so that when they learn it, they don't have to clinically reevaluate and rediscover periodization. And that's the thing that I think maybe a misreading of your article could lead people to conclude, is to be like, well, John, is it Kiely?
Kiely, yeah.
Kiely. Okay, sweet. That's exactly what it looks like. So, well, Kiely said that periodization is total myth and bullshit. I'm not even going to read any of this other shit. Volume, intensity, all that stuff's stupid. Specificity, overload, that's not even defined terms. It's not science. I'm just going to discover what training looks like with my athlete in a dialectical, ecological relationship with coaching. That I wouldn't recommend for most people, because then they miss all the tons of training wisdom, either formal or informal, from years and years of training. Like if I want to know about training, I want to look at Mike Teixeira's work. If I want to learn about RPE, I'm going to read his shit. And some of the stuff might just be weird Teixeira quirks, but some of it make really real fucking sense. So I wouldn't say, RPE is dogmatic and it's stupid. I would say, RPE has upsides and downsides. I'm going to take as many of the upsides as I can and keep them. That's how I see the concept of modern periodization. It's a Dr. Stone term, and he means modern periodization, I think, a little bit different to him what it means to me. But to me, it means a collection of ideas, structuring underlying training that seem to work and make lots of sense, and usually work on average as the basis of a plan. That I don't want to throw away. But all the other dogma, like, what about Matveyev? What about a CERN? I bet we sweep that shit right the fuck off. I don't know.
Okay, perfect. I guess there's a couple of things I say there. First of all, certainly in nothing I've ever wrote or no conversation I've ever had did I say you should throw out like consideration of intensity volume. What I'm saying is throw away the dogma so you plan more carefully. Do the cognitive work yourself. Think through the hard questions yourself. Don't just read it in a paper or subscribe to somebody's periodization method. Do the work. You're the coach. Get off your fucking ass and do it. Rather than, oh, well, I'm going to take it from a book, or I'm going to take it from a theory, or take it from a podcast, or anything like that. So that's, first of all, just to say that.
Agreed.
So, and I know we're not going to get into it now, but you know, there's an academic definition of periodization, and then there's the overlapping fuzziness in the practical world, where periodization is synonymous with planning. You know, and that's fair enough. We're probably never going to get away from the word, but I do think we need to move away from the dogma. Now, one point you did make that I totally agree with. If you are working with either lots of athletes or maybe young athletes or medium level athletes, you have to have a plan. You have to have a sensible plan. By all means, you know, buy into someone else's periodization model, because
or just know the principles and make the plan yourself. That's even better.
Well, yeah, it's like it's in a sense the plan isn't so much the issue unless you just do something stupid. You know, unless there's big changes of intensity over small times or short time frames, unless you really screw up with volume, unless you're doing, you know, all specific work and no general work or vice versa. Unless you get the balance wrong, it's okay. You can use any model you want in a sense, and we need to stop the kind of and I think it's petered out now, the kind of tribal warfare between block periodization, Verkhoshansky, drive-by shootings with Matveev, you know, all this type of stuff. That's one thing. My critique of periodization, and it wasn't even meant as a criticism, it was meant as a let's just like, you know, the Wizard of Oz, let's just look behind the curtain here and see what's actually there. And again, it was for my benefit as a sports professional and, you know, ex-athlete, coach, all that. Now, I think there's a couple of other problems with, and it's, maybe I was going to pin this on periodization, but maybe it's not fair to pin it on periodization. No, let me pin it on periodization just for the sake of interest. We've been sold, or we were sold the story that training planning was all about how you schedule training, volumes, intensities, rep ranges, endure, you know, and so on. But there's so much more to training adaptation than just mechanical load. There is, and I think that the last time we spoke, Mike T, we talked about stress, for example. How you walk into the weight room is going to have a big influence on your adaptations. Your stress levels in normal life are going to affect how quickly you recover, how well you adapt. Your stress levels are going to definitely impact your injury rate. There's that. There's the
maybe
whole
intent of training as well. Like, do you train
absolutely
with intentionality?
I'd actually even go a step further, and this may sound out there, and I know we're not going to be able to get into it, but your sense of purpose when you train, your sense of personal meaning. This is relevant to me. This session can help me achieve where I want to be, regardless of where that is. I think all of that maps directly to your adaptation. It's not just mechanical. It's not just how's my nutrition. It's my set of beliefs, my confidence in this. It's kind of stress effects intermingled with placebo effects. All these psycho-emotional and belief issues that change your neurobiological backdrop, which forms the foundation upon which you overlay mechanical training stimuli. That type of stuff we haven't even touched because we felt, well, we have a complete theory, but we haven't.
Mike, I know we're a bit over on time. What you told me your time limit was. Do we need to wrap up here?
think I could like address that quickly and then wrap up if that's okay.
Sure, that's fine.
Could I just, I'm sorry
Sorry.
for this.
No, it's okay.
So not just to leave this unsaid, one of the things you did mention in your blog post, Mike Guy, was that you felt I had set up a straw man. And I don't feel I did. I go through a lot of trouble to write as honestly but as fairly as I can. So I didn't think I set up a straw man, but I'm willing to learn if I did. So if you can show me where I did, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, I suppose the straw man is that, I went to school for 3 years to learn periodization theory, and that most of the critiques leveled on the piece were not at what I learned in school. And I was in the only PhD program in the United States for sports science. So I was wondering, where are the folks that hold these opinions of periodization against whom the critiques are leveled? But if you're talking to coaches, if you're talking to practitioners, if you're talking sort of out of touch academicians, I think there's plenty of folks that you absolutely didn't straw man. And there's, the kind of people that say, well, I'm a Matveev guy, I'm an Asurin guy. Like, yeah, well, hell yeah, all those critiques apply. I think there's a better practice of periodization. I think, very selfishly that I embody that practice or try to proselytize it as much as possible. So I had been pushing. So, for example, Greg Knuckles and I co-authored a 2-part article for Juggernaut called "There Is Only One Kind of Periodization." And that is what we sort of saw as periodization, is the intelligent manipulation of training variables to accomplish a certain result. And I thought that if your paper was targeted at that understanding of periodization, then it absolutely was a straw man. But speaking to you, I don't believe it was. So I don't believe you intentionally straw manned anything. I don't assume that. It read to me as a straw man because my understanding of what periodization was very different than what you had in
mind. Well, I think I could only go by the definitions that are out there, and I'm not going to push it.
Sure.
I presented the definitions and I critiqued the academic papers. I couldn't go quoting coaches and say this coach or that coach. And anyway, there would be no point because there's all kinds of opinions out there. But look, thanks for clarifying that. The other thing I'd add, and this is just, I might be coming across here as I'm really confident in my perspectives. I'm not, because I shouldn't be, and I hope they change. And I'm looking for evidence, I'm looking for ways to change them. Back around 2000, I'd already been an international athlete. I'd been an international coach. I was working in a decent job with funded athletes on the Irish Olympic program. I left all that to go and study under Mike Stone because he was Mr. Periodization and I wanted to learn from him. So I moved country, sold up everything to go and, so he could tell me what periodization was. So I would have experience with Mike, and I went there to be convinced because I felt I needed to be convinced, but I came away unconvinced.
Yeah, I think that's the Mike Stone thing is a topic for another time.
Sure. Well, no, I mean it's not a personal thing at all, obviously, but
sure,
they are the lengths I went to learn periodization because I didn't have the confidence that maybe that's wrong. I assumed I wasn't seeing something.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I got to get going, unfortunately. I would love to have sort of ranted a little bit about the psychosocial perspective, if I may, in 20 seconds. Is that okay?
Go for it.
Yeah. I think the sort of psychosocial influences, the intentionality of training, et cetera, background, stress response, I think they are valuable. I don't know if they're more valuable than the loading parameters applied. I think they all need to be considered, although I am a little bit skeptical as to how much reach they have. A lot of professional athletes and very high-level athletes hate the weight room, don't give a shit about it, don't want to be there, and they outperform everybody. They get strong in spite of themselves because of the mechanical loading that is applied to them. A lot of professional athletes, and you've worked with enough to probably get a sense of this, so much like their sport, they're just really good at it. It lets them have sex with a lot of women and make money, and that's why they stick around. So a lot of times, I certainly wouldn't want anyone to get the idea that, like, if you really want it, you really will it, you really come in with intent every single training session, that you're going to obviate your genetics and or mechanical loading. This is someone who's, you're pulling 600 on your best day. Someone who pulls 700 and is never trying will always be stronger than, will always beat you at a meet. So I still think that genetic variables and loading variables and nutritional variables predominate, but I absolutely think those other variables, psychosocial, et cetera, need to be taken into account. How do you take them into account ecologically? How do you establish a relationship with an athlete where you actually get the honest truth about what's going on? Can you ever get real buy-in? To what degree you can get it? Those are all very, very interesting questions to me. But again, I think for another time.
15-second retort. First of all, and I guess this is the one thing I can totally disagree with you on. I've never met athletes like that who are doing it for the sake of money or having sex with other women. I've never worked with a top level athlete like that. They're all engaged. It's their life. It's their passion. They put it on the line. Of course, you're right. Mechanical training stimuli are where it starts and ends. No one is saying that, but belief mediates quite a lot of training adaptation. You can see that very clearly with something like the placebo research, where, placebo can outperform opioids and painkilling things. What you believe matters a lot. And I think this speaks to the influence of the coach, extends far beyond putting together a training program, regardless of how well or not it's planned. How the coach interacts with the athlete engenders belief and fosters buy-in and trust and high expectation. They're all fundamental to me.
I gotcha. We'd probably fall on slightly different sides of the spectrum on that. Maybe that's something we could talk about.
No problem.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot for joining. Mike, thanks for hanging around for some extra time. John, good to talk with you again.
Thank you, Mike. Both Mikes. Mike, nice to meet you, and thank you.
Likewise. A true pleasure.
All right. We'll have to do this again sometime. Have a good one, guys. Thanks. I hope you found that valuable. So if you enjoyed that, if you are interested in learning more about how I see the training world and how I go about programming training for myself or my athletes, I would encourage you to check out RTS Classroom. We have a class starting up in April, and we start out with our Emerging Strategies Framework. And that class is designed to teach you a process for kind of having a plan and then making reasonable individualization strategies based off of emerging information. So, for example, in this conversation, I talked about the process that I went through with Brett Gibbs. I've gone through lots and lots of iterations of that type of thing, and often come to surprising conclusions, sometimes come to fairly typical conclusions, but it's a way for me to know with some degree of as much certainty as you can get in a dynamic training environment. So if you're interested in stuff like that, if you'd like to learn more, you can go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, and under the store link you can find more information on Classroom, and the registration is open until I believe April 12th, so make sure that you check that out, and if you run into any issues or have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks for listening.